it's a pleasure to have with me in studio my friend and colleague Alexander Cockburn, who is longtime columnist for The Nation magazine, co-editor of Counterpunch, which you can subscribe to by snail mail or get at counterpunch.org, and the co-author of a brand new book from Verso called Imperial Crusades. That's Alexander Cockburn and Jeffrey Sinclair, and it's on the recent wars. It didn't begin with Iraq and shock and awe. It takes us through the campaign in Yugoslavia and Afghanistan. And I want to congratulate you on your new book.
Thank you, Saul.
And I want to get right into it, because in Counterpunch, which comes out daily, except for the weekend, so it's 6 times a week, you and Jeffrey Sinclair put this out. You wrote in a recent, a week ago or so, a column called Watching Niagara, Stupid Leaders, Useless Spies, Angry World. And I thought in those phrases you have captured rather a large landscape, almost photographically. And let's start with stupid leaders, favorite subject of mine. We have just seen President George W. Bush. I'm not inferring, of course, that he is stupid. But George W. Bush has not only done the Iraq scenario, but he has also recently announced Cuba policies, which are draconian in nature, and which are opposed by the leading multinational corporations, like the big grain companies like Archer Daniels Midland or Tyson's Chicken, all the people who are selling lots of stuff to Cuba. It's opposed also by some of the so-called dissidents in Cuba. It's opposed by a large sector of the Miami Cuban community. And all of the business critiques say the same thing, that he's doing this just to please a small coterie of people and essentially oppose the interests of the multinational corporations. Now, is this an administration, from your observation, totally without foresight, or simply unconcerned with the consequences of its action?
I think in that case it was just they had to do the thank you to the Miami Cubans who helped them fix the 2000 elections, and were useful for Jeb Bush in becoming governor. And they might have had memos on the table from the political people on the Hill saying, look, some of our biggest contributors are opposed to this, but then Karl Rove on the political directorate said, this is a thank you that we have to make. I think, to go to the Commander-in-Chief, he is a man of limited vision and knowledge, there's no doubt about it. I mean, I personally take the view that Jerry Ford was one of our greatest presidents. He didn't serve very long. He did comparatively little damage. He had Betty Ford, he put Stevens on the bench, and then he quit. And he was not a very intelligent man. So you don't have to be bright. I think in the case of Bush and the current high command, they are, if you look at history, they are a very stupid, limited lot. I mean, just looking at Iraq, if you look at the American commanders after World War II, the people who took over Germany, the big administrators, they were very competent people. They ran Germany pretty well. The people who ran Japan ran it well. You may disagree with how they ran it, but they knew what they were doing. But if you look at what they planned to do in Iraq and how they tried to carry it out, it is a tremendous chronicle of folly. You can go rather akin, if anyone's of a classical bent in the audience, they might want to go and look at Thucydides' account of the famous Nicias expedition to Syracuse in 412, which was the great Athenian reverse. They'd been egged into war against Syracuse by Alcibiades, the silver-tongued demagogue, and off they went, and one disaster after another. It was the mightiest troop flotilla that had ever gone off. And you look at one failure from the WMD failure forward to the occupation. My brother Patrick is in Iraq frequently for the Independent. He says in the morning you look out the window of the hotel, there's the power station. There are 4 chimneys on the power station. You can tell whether the chimneys are belching out smoke, in which case, if all 4 are going, maybe you'll have power for 8 hours. If all 2 are going, you're going to have power for a little bit. And if there's 1 going, you know that it'll be gone in a couple of hours. He says the history of the US occupation is right there. Iraqis have they can't run their lives. Their physical security is not there. From the moment that Rumsfeld said that the looting and disorders after the initial American triumph were, the exuberance of freedom, was some typically Rumsfeldian phrase. Your old friend and partially mine, C. Wright Mills, had a great phrase, crackpot realism. Mm-hmm. These people are crackpot realists. They have all their game plans lined up. They're all stamped top secret. It's all in the Woodward book. They're always reading these things called top secret. And I wrote the other day, I said they would have been better off to throw the top secret reports in the wastepaper basket, go out the White House, cross Pennsylvania Avenue, hail a taxi and say, tell me what's going on. They would have learned, as you well know, the taxi driver usually knows, particularly if in this case he's a Somali in Washington, in which case he's incredibly well informed and is probably a graduate. This is the thing. Now they're in Iraq. Now, let alone it's immoral and monstrous to torture captives, but you constantly hear reports not just of this abuse in the prisons, this torture. New York Times, by the way, has chosen the word abuse, you'll notice.
Yes.
But I heard from my brothers early on, Iraqi families say that when the soldiers come in to search their houses, the Red Cross, by the way, have said that 90% of all searches end up with the arrest of people who are innocent, 90%. They go in, they herd them into a room or outside, they make they humiliate the families, they smash up the things. Then the family goes back. Time and again they discover that the safe in their house, the little security box, has been looted and they've lost all their money. So there is a consistent record of actually robbery. So this shows that throughout the armed forces and in the Bremer lot, there's an absolute failure of leadership and of officer quality leadership. The men and women have become an undisciplined rabble, quite clearly, in many, many cases, in which case all these abuses, some of which obviously were set in motion by the military interrogators, as take place. But this is all stupid, because they're on a moral crusade. I mean, if it was just a straight occupying force saying, look, we're going to give you what for? When they went to Afghanistan, there was no moral crusade. They said, the Taliban gave sanction to Osama, and we're going to show them what for. They stood by, and indeed, on some accounts, condoned the murder of several hundred, if not thousands, of Taliban prisoners after the capture of Kunduz. And you can trace back from the earliest days how the moral rot just set in. But it was all short-sighted, because now they've lost the sympathy of the Arab world, and, the picture of Private Lindy with the chap on the other, you could call him, on the dog leash, it's finished them all.
Alexander, you've been following American presidential rhetoric for decades now, as I have. And I have never heard a president use the word free or freedom more than George W. Bush. I mean, Kennedy liked that word. And I remember him making a speech to the Cuban people during the missile crisis, telling the Cuban people how he was their friend after he had launched, I don't know how many thousand terrorist missions into Cuba, including assassination, killed hundreds of Cubans and destroyed tens of millions of dollars of property. And he assured them that he was their friend, and what he wanted for them was freedom. Nixon said the same thing. Well, almost every president has repeated it. Now, George Bush the other day in his press conference must have used the term a free Iraq a dozen times. His vocabulary is limited, but this one was overused to the point where I felt it was hitting me on the head with a hammer. When you hear those words coming out of Bush's mouth, where he says, I want to free Cuba, I want to free Iraq, I want to free Afghanistan, what do you think he means by freedom?
I think it's funny that I think he's got the idea. They sold him on the Iraq enterprise on the idea that you were freeing Iraqis. And he got that firmly in his head. And he's holding, a bit like Reagan, who is, of course, a polished orator and no mean opponent, as Bobby Kennedy found to his cost when he tried to debate Reagan. Reagan was pretty fast on his feet when he had to be. Bush, I don't think he is at all. And I think he has a real inhibition. He doesn't appear to be able to think very fast in public, which is like the other day, using this word freedom, he said Iraq. This was about 10 minutes after he had a briefing from Rumsfeld on the torture photos. He went out to an audience, I think in Cincinnati, and said Iraq is now free of rape and torture rooms. Mm-hmm. I mean, he just literally had the briefing from Rumsfeld. So I don't think he's able to re-import things into his any sort of countermanding material into what he's actually got embedded in his brain as the speech of the day. I think he thinks, you know, that there are very bad guys out there, and they're usually got Arab names or maybe Korean names. I think he believes he has a very, very simple view of the world. He's had a very sheltered life, really. He's, you know, a foreign adventure in the US forces was certainly not his ken, and the architecture of his moral and political ideas are incredibly simple.